wonderful, pellucid light lit the seascape all around the next morning as, after a damp night under canvas, the royal party began their journey across Mile. Osrith was glad to have been near the king that night, for though she would have used buoy, she feared she would not close her eyes that night, otherwise they had slung oiled linen over branches and slept beneath them, Osrith next to Domhnall, wrapped close with her cloak on a second linen. But she had barely closed her eyes before footsteps outside, tagged on duty, then Fergus, made her open them. As a chill wind buffeted the canvas, miles across the water-heard stags roared from among the hills of far-off Ireland, and far out in the bays the snort of a grey seal surfacing to breathe. When Fergus roused her to her duty hours, the night sky was glowing with green and blue light, and she held buoy close to her as, after some hours, the lights faded and a reticent dawn appeared. Here, Domhnall passed food and what looked like ale in a leather skin around them all. He was no longer the king, as they sat, in the proto-dawn light, chewing on hearty food, made of meat and oats, drinking water from a spring on the island. But it was no water, instead spirit burned Osrith's throat, and the warriors and the princes all laughed, and she laughed too. How could she have been so mournful? After that, the trip was easier. The water was high and stormy, which Osrith disliked, and looking into it made her panic. So instead, she looked at the scenery, highlands and a valley that was flanked by soft undulating mountains creating a natural barrier. Indeed, as they neared, it seemed as if clouds were being trapped on the other side of the mountains, casting sullen darkness, while on their side the sunlight illuminated the regular rock formations which looked to Osrith as if giants might have carved the rocks and sculpted the waterway with flint hand axes, which, if it were true, meant they would be as big as the stones standing upright in rings which appeared every so often, between mountains, or high points on the land. Glenorchy, Greogair's fortress, nestled in a nest of mountains along a strait of water between Mile and the mainland. Osrith thought she would recognize it, for it must have been the way they had come out to Iona, fleeing as they were Glasgow, and Eochaid and Girrick. But Domhnall said that they had left the Clyde River further south in Strathclyde and travelled over the open sea to the Holy Island. Finolai had been with them, Osrith remembered, as the fleet of boats arced around a headland, and she pictured his open, happy face, pale yellow hair and sparkling pale blue eyes. The day imbued Osrith with optimism, and she felt sure he had made good his escape, and was now happy. The day after next they would be going north, to Dund, and were staying here, in Greogair's castle, to prepare. Osrith watched as the red sandstone block was unloaded from its boat, followed by chests and, finally, Domhnall's throne, and carried slowly and procession-like into the wooden fortress. "How are we getting north?" Tagged asked. "How far is Dund? Do we walk?" "Many miles south," Domhnall replied. "Greogair has beasts we will ride. We must be there swiftly. Then, into Scone, where I will be crowned thrice, of Dalriada, of Pitland and of Alba." And that would be the declaration of war, Osrith thought. For to declare himself king of Alba meant king of the Strathclyde Cymric too, Eochaid's throne. She looked up to the horses as she, tagged, Fergus and several of Greogair's men cleaned them out. The animals looked good, well-fed and healthy, and Osrith wondered whether she would have more success in riding one than she had before. "We taught you to ride at Scone," Tagged reminded her, as Osrith looked across the coat of the black mare she had just been brushing. She smiled. "Finolai had had the patience," she said quietly. Tagged said nothing. Not any of the three of them had mentioned his name since he had disappeared, and Osrith would have dearly liked to have told Tagged that she had helped him escape slavery. "Get up on her," Tagged urged. "You will need to practice." Osrith nodded, springing up onto the mare's back. As Tagged let go the rope which tethered the horse to her railing, it turned, and she immediately fell off. There was laughter from Greogair's men and Fergus and Tagged, and Osrith smiled weakly, brushing herself off of the stones and dirt, leaping towards the horse's back. It turned, and this time, she managed to keep her balance. "Squeeze your knees into its flanks," Tagged suggested, looking at Osrith's form. "That way you will stay on." He passed Osrith the reins. "Use the leather on the bit to guide the horse, left, All right, he demonstrated. The horse shook her head a little and then slowly turned in its stable. Osrith wobbled, but bent low, keeping her knees close to the horse's sides. I remember now, Osrith said, as the mare stepped slowly towards the stable door. If she was going to fall again, she did not want it to be in front of the warriors. Instead, she guided the mare along the low path next to the harbor, the autumnal sun still high and bright, the air still warm from its irradiation. It was as the horse bore right that she fell again, slipping from the saddle. As she jumped up to it again, Osrith heard a quiet chuckle ahead of her. It was Domhnall, smiling lips, his pale eyes crinkled in mirth. "Move the way the horse moves," he suggested, walking up to her. Osrith took the horse a few steps, but then lost her balance, grabbing for the pommel of the saddle as her legs slipped. "Come on, I'll show ye." He helped her up into the saddle again, leaping up behind her as she held the reins. She felt his warm breath on her neck as he mounted, putting his hands on hers. "Take her forward a little, we will just go to that linn up ahead." Deceptively, the pool Domhnall meant was further than it looked, and as it looked as if she was going to fall off again, Domhnall reached over and held her hips, holding them down onto the mare's back. They were warm and strong, and Osrith felt her nervous determination to ride the horse give way to confidence. "Use your knees," Domhnall instructed, "but keep low. As she moves, go with her motion, like a good lover." At this, Osrith laughed loudly, then bore her hips down as he suggested. The animal felt more in her control than before, and she quickened to the silver pool ahead of them. But she could not keep her bottom down. When the horse moved upwards, Osrith's hips rose off its saddle and she had to push her knees inwards to stop herself from falling off. "My thanks, Prince Domhnall," Osrith said, as he slid from behind the saddle. "Not Prince, not here," Domhnall said, guiding the horse around to face the way back. "How close are you to finding your sister?" Osrith wanted to ask, but instead, she tore her mind to the morning. "How long will it take until we get to Dund?" "Less than a day. Domhnall says we are to start early." "Go on, I want to see you on your own." He let go of the rein, and Osrith tentatively leaned her body down, pushing his firm hands onto her hips and bottom, pressing her onto the horse's back. The horse trotted on, at a good pace, but then began to speed up. How was she to slow down when the mare had quickened so? Digging in her knees, Osrith held on, until the horse brought its own speed down. Osrith breathed, her heart hammering. Somehow she managed to get the beast to turn. Domhnall was standing on the path, laughing. "I would be most grateful, Lord, if you were to take this horse back to her stables." She made to slide from the saddle, but Domhnall had got on behind her, instead. "Move up," he said, shuffling her forward, and took the reins, easing the horse into a steady trot. "You need to get used to it. We ride south tomorrow and you must ride with the king. You can't be falling off." He took her hands and eased them onto the leather straps. "Take us back, Osrith. You will soon get used to it." But Osrith knew she disliked horse riding. Even this docile beast she couldn't handle. "Let me walk," Osrith told herself, "any time that I can." But her thoughts were shattered as words, black curses, were being exchanged loudly, echoed up the valley as they approached the rear gates of the fortress. Domhnall and Constantine again, or, rather, Constantine, angry at something his cousin had said, or done. "I will put this mare to her hay," Osrith said, diplomatically as Domhnall slid from behind her, stalking towards the inner rampart, wherein the hall of the fortress sat, large and bold, at the very center of Grioghair's dominion. The swearing continued with some very select adjectives through the wood. "From here," Taggart had explained, Grioghair, the enormously influential ally of King Domhnall, controlled a wide network of trade with the Strathclyde Cymric, with families descended from the original Cymric abbots, who held different lands since before even the Gaels, and the Norse, at times warring with them, at many others supplying them goods. "It is unfortunate that you killed Colleen," he had told her. Grioghair's sister married the chief of the Caimbileach. Leading the black-coated horse into her stall, she thought of that night. What else could she have done? The mare bent her head to her food, leaving a hefty deposit of gratitude at Osrith's feet. "You'll clean that," a voice behind her made her turn, as 3 warriors bore down on her, too late for Osrith to draw her blade. "Ye killed our lord," one continued, before lunging at her. Osrith ducked, 2 of the 3 men colliding with one another as she moved out of the way. The third barred her path, swinging an uppercut into her stomach. Osrith sagged, the wind knocked from her as one of the other men grabbed her legs, tumbling her to the floor. "Not his unib," one said, as the man who stood near her head. Her face, Osrith knew, Incomrade, presumably the voices skulking around outside Iona's fortifications. "He will need to look bonny for the king." There was menace in the voice, and she knew they were there to assault her for her killing. She scrabbled on the floor, but this seemed to infuriate them, and one knelt her face into the horse droppings. "Fight me, then," Osrith spluttered hoarsely, as she scrabbled for Buey. "English," one of them declared, and another kicked her in the stomach again. "Don't let him up." She scrabbled on the floor, trying to avoid the blows. Osrith's hand was close to Buey, but before she could get purchase on its handle, she had been kicked once more, this time in the ball bag, or where her ball bag might have been if she had been a man. The second of confusion was enough. Launching herself at the men, she brought one down using the same tactic as one had used on her, toppling him like a tree flat onto his back into the straw. The mare she had ridden whinnied at the disturbance, stepping back on her hooves as the fight continued. Osrith scrabbled Buey from her scabbard, holding the blade defiantly as horse excrement slopped off her face. Their warrior to her left had withdrawn his too, and he hovered before her, his face drawing into a snarl. The second, shorter and stockier, had also withdrawn his weapon. Bastard English. He launched himself at Osrith, who was quicker, and she ducked under his arm, whipping round and doubling back onto the taller man. But he was ready, and elbowed his sword arm back into her ribs. There was a sickening crunch. Osrith dropped to her knees. Already a tightness in her chest grew as she struggled to ventilate her lungs. The taller man gloated as Osrith groped for Buey, on the floor before her. He made to stand on her hand, but Osrith was too fast for him, and slashed left, using a stable hook, lying behind him, on which the horse's hay was usually hung. It scraped the back of his leg, and he fell onto her. Or rather, where Osrith had been, she had stretched right as the stockier man had thrust a fist in her direction, catching the hook quickly with force around his boot. He tried to shake her off, but only succeeded in slipping on his other foot, off-balancing himself and crashing like a boulder to the floor. Osrith scooped up Buey just before he crashed onto it. She used her sword to help herself to her feet, staggering out of the stables, propping herself up outside, trying to breathe without the pain crushing in her chest. Then, she felt her face. At least the horse shit would come off, and Osrith made her way steadily to the kitchen. Then, thinking better of it, the men who had ambushed her may have friends, made her way to the burn they had passed as Domhnall had ridden the black mare back. She breathed, her chest feeling heavy. She had fought 3 of them, no need for another warrior, no need for a man to protect her, or fight for her. And she had enjoyed fighting. Her experience with 9 fingers had not killed her will to battle. Osrith breathed deeply again. Not much to do for broken ribs, she thought as her feet got her to the rough path by the mountain bank, just rest them, but little chance if they were riding the next day. Just as she was reaching the beck, a flame of red hair streaked in her line of sight as Fergus got to his feet, letting go of the hands of a black-haired maid, who ran at the sight of Osrith. At the sight of Osrith covered in shit, Fergus began to laugh. She smiled too, despite the pain in her chest. "What's her name?" Osrith asked, as she sank her face into the fast-flowing water, grabbing at the water weed and scrubbing at her face with it. "Ailey," he replied, as Osrith came up for air. She had never seen Fergus with a woman, nor even speaking of one. A late beginner, she surmised. "Is it all off the shit?" Osrith nodded, and Fergus nodded too. She straightened up and proceeded to walk back the way she had come, her comrade in arms walking next to her. "How did you cleaning the stables with your face?" He looked at her attire, and Buey, which was dull and dirty, and his brown eyes narrowed. "You've been in a fight," he accused. But Osrith shushed him. As the commotion in the stable yard grew, he gave Osrith a "so you've already had your fun" look, before tearing off from her side, adding his blade to the ever-growing brawl that was taking place. Osrith peered round, catching sight of all three Cambulach men who had ambushed her, watching them exchange blows with Grioghair's men. As she watched, Fergus had joined in, though fighting whom with whom was unclear, and behind him, Tag's bright, fair hair glimmered. Eventually, as night began to fall, the fight petered out, and the men who had just been hammering one another hauled themselves into the hall for food. Osrith followed, with a bright, chatty Fergus and a worse-for-wear Tagged, who had been jumped on by three of Grioghair's men, giving as many thumps and kicks as he had received. Meat from recently butchered livestock, beef and mutton, was served, and a toast was made by Grioghair to his king with what Osrith heard to be water but was in fact Jbetha, welcome water, the pure which burned her throat and warmed her stomach as she joined in with the feast. As in Iona, Constantine sat with his brother and with Domhnall on a table with Grioghair and another man, who Osrith recognized as being one who had been with him creeping about outside Iona's monastery. Had they really been simply searching for Domhnall? Could Grioghair's explanation, that he thought the monastery overrun with Norse be true? No matter how she considered it, sounded weak. They had brought Domhnall his finery and his throne, but had crept about thinking the occupants were Norse. That didn't make sense. They would have seen from the island's one tiny harbour no Norse ships, only the little coracles in which they had sailed from Rathlin. So why creep and ambush, risking deaths of your men if you knew it was only your king beyond the ramparts, and in prayer, too? A tale began, as Osrith took the ale jug from next to a very happy-looking Fergus, Innis Broglian, summer, and how Domhnall, aged 12, had stood next to Grioghair, his father Corsten and his uncle. The island off Street Andrews had been his first battle, when Harold Finehair had gone on to lay waste to Pitland, and how, since he had killed the mighty of our raids, had disintegrated now the Scots posed a formidable foe. The Scots, thought Osrith. It was the first time she had heard that word, to describe an amalgamation of three distinct areas of Alba, and for each, once they had been to Dund. At the ceremony at Scone, Domhnall would be crowned king, the first king to rule equally, and as one, over all three. It was no wonder Eochaid had taken up arms against him, for one of those kingdoms was Strathclyde. Domhnall, no less, would be declaring his kingship over all of the lands above the Two-Eyed, putting into practice what Sained Macatildalpin, his grandfather, had begun. In the morning, Osrith expected, they would ride to Dund, moving in procession carefully, slowly and with precision, like Findlyarth and Flansinna, Muir's husband kings. It was the ritual and ceremony that would matter, for all to see a king moving through his land. Osrith could see, in her mind's eye, her lord, as he carried himself as such through the landscape, his long, black hair combed neatly and arranged over his blue cloak, Constantine and Domhnall just behind, Domhnall taller with his oval face as serious as that of his cousin, gleaming grey eyes taking in the dull Riordan countryside, whereas Constantine, a little shorter, for he was younger than Domhnall, his nose more curled, his lips more serious, flanking Domhnall. Yet, he had been cursing at the king just that afternoon and, for all to hear, Domhnall had allowed him to. Osrith looked across to their table. In the tallow candlelight, she looked at the serious features of her former lover. He had barely spoken a word to her since Doia, nor tried to hump her, which was something Osrith was grateful for. Domhnall got to his unsteady feet, raising his tankard in praise of Grioghair and all the battles gone and to come. 3 lands of people had to accept him, Osrith thought, as Constantine sipped from his beaker too, the Gaels, the Picts and the Cymric. Strathclyde was by far the most difficult kingdom to rule, for not only Eochaid reigned but his kingdom claimed Cumbraland from the old times, from 300 years before, when the Romans left. But the Strathclyde Cymric were weak under Eochaid and Giric. Together they had struggled to defend Dunnottar, and had been pushed into retreat into the castle by two Danes leading their own army up from Eothwick. The brothers were defeated, but Eochaid and Geric lost many men, and the alliance between the Cymric and the Picts was all but broken. Domhnall had told them this as they were under sail from Mile, away from being overheard. It always came down to Strathclyde. How was Domhnall to solve that problem? Now is the time to attack, he had declared. The brothers have gone south to fight the Northumbrians, although there will always be others. And then, as singing began, Greogair's eyes met hers. Osrith realized, as she looked away, that the man had been staring at her for some time. As Osrith excused herself, citing the early start in the morning, she noticed, to her horror, that Greogair made to rise too. Osrith's heart beat fast. Why was he getting up too? Did he want to speak to her? Had he sent the Caimbilach on her? But then Domhnall pushed him back into his chair and filled up his tankard, hand on his ally's shoulder, clearly happily inebriated and insisting his friend join him. But his eyes were on her, as she left the hall and headed to the Hale Oft, where the warriors would sleep. The night was cold, which suggested a fresh morning the next day. They were to camp overnight at another stronghold belonging to Greogair next to Dund, before Domhnall's coronation. Osrith inhaled deeply of the crisp evening air. She would have to go back in and up the ladder through the Hale Oft hatch to reach the straw, rather than the quicker vault up the side of the wall. No matter how much she pretended, she really was in quite a bit of pain from the kicking and beating she had taken. As she made her way past the horses, the black mare she had ridden that afternoon with Domhnall, the two skewballs and half a dozen of single color, white, black and brown, she paused, wondering if it was the mare she would be riding the next day, or another of these. Would she stay on? Would she be able to control the horse? Those behind Muirett's Findlaith's funeral had walked slowly and not cantered away like the mare that afternoon. She supposed She supposed what? A noise had made Osrith stop extrapolating her king's motives on his procession in the morning. Behind her, the horses, asleep, moved their hooves with a soft clatter, puffing quietly their soporific breath. And there was the noise again, one of leather on stone. Someone was following her. But who? The leather scraped stone again, and Osrith silently withdrew Buay from her fleece-lined scabbard. Her mind's first thought was that Constantine had followed her, to play a childish trick on her, and she stood silently, her breath as quiet as she could make it while her lungs pushed against her broken ribs. Who else could it be? "Do not sleep tonight, English boy," a voice came suddenly. But the speaker did not move any closer to Osrith. "For you killed our lord. Do not sleep any night." And then, a quick sound of boots turning on stone left Osrith alone at the bottom of the ladder to the Hale Oft, holding her sword. But still she turned to shout, though no words took form. "I was doing my lord's work." Osrith wanted to scream, "I was protecting my lord from harm." And Osrith didn't sleep, or at least, she thought she wouldn't. Her body ached too much to get comfortable in the first place, and her heart was racing, her mind overwhelmed with thoughts. Secondly, the man who had threatened her was clearly one of those, or kin of, the men who had deliberately pursued her that evening. They hadn't forgotten indeed, they sounded more determined to harass her, Osrith, the boy they thought her to be. Instead, she listened to the sounds of the night, of the hall, still filled with laughter and singing, of an owl hooting not far from the burn, the moon passing through a gap in the wooden wall of the stables, only to ebb away as it moved higher. And then Osrith's ears caught the sound of people just outside, down below, past the cleared-out horse straw. They were talking purposefully quiet, so that their conversation could not be discerned, yet several phrases drifted up, through the still night air, through the small gap in the stable's wooden walls, and into her ears. Was it the voice who had stopped her in the stables? Was it Greogair? It was hard to be sure. They didn't want to be heard, that was for sure, and they spoke Gaelish with a dull Riordan accent, Constantine's and Domhnall's accent, not a Cymric one, nor yet an Irian one. She relaxed a little, trying to pick out words. Osrith heard names, Eochaid and Geric. That was understandable. They were Domhnall's enemies. Thorgilson. Eric and Siegfried. Norse brothers, one of them said. A shuffling below of feet in straw drowned out more phrases, but ones which did catch her ears were of more Danes, ones whose names she did know, ones which haunted her, Kjartan ... Sven ... and then Elfric. Osrith sat up. Kjartan and his son killed. That was fine news indeed. And that Ivar Ivarsson was king in the Ofvic, and another king, one said, on the Cumbraland throne, Guthard Hearthknut. And what was her uncle to do with anything? Ruthlessly bargaining again to defend with his life the fortress of Bibbenberg, which he had usurped from her brother. Her younger brother, Elfric's son, would be a young child now, perhaps 3. He would soon be trained in war, but also, in mind, that Bibbenberg was his own. Osrith stared out of the gap and at the night sky, as cheers and shouts, muted, yet persistent, drifted from the direction of the hall, merry still with laughter and song. A gibbous moon hung in the sky, glimmering its generous light over the fortress, lending light to the backboards of the stable. Presumably these men, whoever they were, conversing below her, were discussing strategy of some kind. Strathclyde had once ruled Cumbraland. This Osrith knew, for her mother, as her aunt, had told her many times. Presumably any king of Cumbraland would wish to ally himself to Strathclyde's enemies, to secure his land. It was what she would do, Osrith thought, as a shiver of fear she would be discovered. She lay down in the straw, wishing she hadn't, for the pain in her ribs stabbed into her chest muscles. She was glad, Osrith thought, as she tried, but failed, to catch more words from the secretive speakers, but heard nothing, so presumably they had gone. Every fight, every success for her lord, Osrith thought, went in her favor, for she fought in Domhnall's name. And then shame overcame her. She should be thinking about was escape. Now she knew where her brother was. But why? Osrith's mind wrestled with the reasoning in the darkness. She was a success in her own right. She was good at fighting. She had proved she could escape. She had escaped from Bibbenberg, through her left hand was now crippled from the arrow that had passed right through it coming from her uncle's bowman. Reason gave way to memory as a vision. Of the dress she had worn at her mother's funeral, the same given back to her on the night before her escape, the night before she was to be handed over. Of the monstrous face of Sven Kjartansson, whom Elfric had promised her in marriage to, a face she had never seen, but sometimes melded in her unguarded thoughts with the face of the dead leader of the Cambulach family whose eyes glazed in horror as she stabbed him. Osrith opened her eyes. The moon was no longer shining into the hail oft, but instead was nearly overhead. She had slept, but a shiver ran through her body. Neither Fergus nor Tagd were up asleep. Shameful though it was, Osrith really wanted them close by. A bang from the stable door caused Osrith to jump forward, her broken ribs objecting heartily. Was someone there? And, if so, were they seeking her? She got to her knees, not daring to look over to the loft hatch, before took over and she was climbing out of the tiny window, holding onto its sill by her fingers. Fool! Osrith chided herself. She had not thought this through, and now faced the inevitable 6-foot drop onto the straw-strewn ground. However she landed, Osrith knew it was going to hurt. She let go, the still night air pushing upwards and back, opposing her fall as she landed in a heap on the ground. Osrith loosened her steel blade, in its scabbard, to push against the ground with, the jolting to her torso adding more to her already weighty list of injuries. But she did not need to. Strong hands took Osrith's triceps, pulling her to her feet, and she struggled, her instinct to run overcoming her curiosity. But the man held her firm. Osrith's heartbeat began to accelerate, but, if it was to be run through to pay for Colleen Cambulach's death, she determined she would see his face. Struggling, she took in his features, and blinked at a face she knew. It was Domhnall. "You're shivering," he said, loosening his grip, and guiding her by her arm closer to the stable building. "Domhnall!" Osrith exclaimed, trying to control the quaking in her voice. "I heard noises in the stable. My sheepskin is still up there." But, she could say no more. A lump had developed in her throat, angry with herself that she had allowed herself to be scared by men who were meant to be allies. "I was dreaming badly," she panted, gulping the cold night air as he held her still, hearing a tremble in her own voice. She swallowed, catching the sound of a very raucous song being sung in the distance. Clearly the merriment was going strong. A bad dream caused you to jump out of a window? Osrith stared at Domhnall, who wasn't mocking her, but instead seemed concerned. Come, Osrith, walk with me, Domhnall encouraged when she didn't answer and, feeling her shudder again, drawing his own cloak from his shoulders and wrapping it around her. Thank you, she said, quietly, smiling a little, as they approached the approximate place where the talking men had been. I was expecting Ferguson tagged. Domhnall returned her smile. Asleep over their table they were on for drinking. Come on. Where? Osrith looked around them. The stable was close to the back gate. Behind them was the hall, and beyond, the harbour. Come on, he said gently, guiding her elbow towards the rear gate of the fortress, which backed onto a steep escarpment of granite, the rocks sticking out from the steep incline and overhanging the burn. Osrith was not normally bothered about the night, but that night the sharp, angular cliff face seemed to loom over her, its shadows being cast onto the floor by the moon, making the narrow river seem beguilingly sinister, as if other people, who might have sought this body of water and been taken through its surface into some terrible place. Wind rushed down the glen, and Osrith turned to look in the direction of the mountains.